skills that exist in Freemasonry and especially outside of it. But what makes some of them even better is when they are fascinating and they're historical. And that is where we find our guest this week on the Craftsmen Online podcast as we welcome author Katheleen Aldworth Foster. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
So as we kind of tease, I'm looking forward to getting into the story of the Lady Freemason, because I know a lot of our brothers that are listening to this podcast, or just men that have an interest in Freemasonry, are going to say, hey, wait a second. I thought Freemasonry was just something that guys were involved with. Before we get into the Lady Freemason story, I'd like to kind of share a little bit of your background. What inspired you or interested you to write the story of this book and to kind of follow the history of Doneraile Court?
Well, I first heard about the Lady Freemason at the Pyramids of Giza in the year 2000. I was 25 years old, and I decided that I needed to be in Jerusalem for Christmas 1999, and I wanted to be at the Pyramids of Giza for Y2K, New Year's Eve. And I was. And it was there that I met a man who was there studying Freemasonry and Freemasonry's ties to, to Egypt. And he told me that I share my name, the Aldworth name, with the first ever female Freemason. And her name was Elizabeth Aldworth. He didn't tell me a whole lot more than that. And it was the year 2000, so it's not like I could just Google her at the time. So I kept this information in my back pocket. And but I was very interested in Freemasonry, though I knew very little. And he sent me the book, The Hierarchy. So that was my introduction to Freemasonry, and that was my introduction to the Lady Freemason. He didn't tell me much about the story. So it was through many years of peeling away this onion that I found out the story and came to the conclusions that I came to about the legend of the Lady Freemason.
All right. I think we're ready to hear the story, because what's fascinating is I know so many guys that fall into, I call it the Masonic rabbit hole of their own, where they hear something in the ritual or they have an idea of something that comes up. And so they start reading all these books or watching lectures or listening to podcasts to get that information. And as you mentioned, this was back in 2000. Here we are 25 years later. Tell us about Elizabeth St. Leger.
So the story is, legend has it, right, that Elizabeth St. Leger, her maiden name, was 17 years old when she was caught spying on Freemasons in the middle of a ritual in her family's home. Now, her father was a Viscount, so they were wealthy English landowners in Ireland. So the story is that she fell asleep in the library, awoke to hear voices. She was caught by the Tyler, who was actually the family's butler, who had to make the decision whether to hand her over to her father and say what he had found and that she may have heard something, seen something, or send her off to bed. Well, he decided to tell her father and her brothers, who were also part of this group. And this story is that her father and her brothers were amongst the men who were willing to kill her and discuss interesting ways in which to do it, until one man stood up and said, wait a minute, this is crazy. Let's put her through the paces. Let's make her the first ever female Freemason, and I will be responsible for her for the rest of my life. And that man was Richard Aldworth, who she married 5 months later. So you've got, this is the thread. This is the true story that is told if you go to Doneraile. And that is what intrigued me, because here we had a mystery, a thriller, and a love story all wrapped up in one. But I didn't plan on writing a nonfiction book. I didn't plan on writing a fiction book. I planned on writing a nonfiction book initially, because I'm a journalist and I spent years working as a television news producer. That's what was in my blood. Writing a fiction book was a real challenge for me.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because our story kind of starts, before 2000, just, a few years before, with Elizabeth's story. And then you're told, hey, you are related to this famous last name of this 17-year-old girl who became Ireland's first female Freemason. And you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. You're doing all this research. You hear the myth for the first time. You're like, this is great. And for our listener that's going, this would actually make a pretty good, documentary or streaming movie. But wait, there's more. We'll get to that later in the podcast. Where did you start to separate the myth from the facts and the history of what actually happened? Tell us about that investigation part.
Well, let me tell you how I ended up there in the first place and how I ended up at her house. The book is called Doneraile Court, The Story of Lady Freemason, for a reason. The house where this all took place is still standing. And it was one of these, there was just a string of strange synchronicities that kept happening to me, and this is one of them. So I mentioned I was a journalist, and I was working in Israel the summer of 2006, covering a war, yet another conflict in the Middle East, and that one was between Hezbollah guerrillas and Israel. And I spent 3 weeks dodging Katyushas. And then I told my bosses, you know what? I have this pre-planned genealogy trip in Ireland, so I've got to fly to Ireland tomorrow. So I flew, and there, right before I left Israel, the internet had now caught up with the Lady Freemason and the Lady Freemason story. So I'd read a little bit about her, and that's when I discovered that she was from County Cork, Ireland. I didn't know that prior to this. When I arrived at Shannon Airport, I said to my dad, "Hey, remember that Aldworth Freemason lady I told you about? Well, it turns out she's from here in County Cork."
Hmm.
And the man that my dad hired to drive our family around Ireland overheard me, and he said, "Yeah, not only is she from here, but her house is still standing. Do you want to go?"
Mm.
So we got in the car at the airport and drove straight to Doneraile Court. So that was the first time I ever saw the house itself. And it is in the middle of a beautiful wildlife preserve that's been owned by the OPW. So it's owned by the state of Ireland. But at the time I was there, it was behind a chain link fence. It was derelict. It was in terrible condition. And it was the bus driver who told me this story as I just described it to you in that kind of detail. He
Hmm.
showed me a back there in town where it says even her father and her brothers were ready to kill her. So this is the story that you hear when you go to Doneraile. So yes, the house is still standing, which is an amazing part of the story, and it is one of the top tourist attractions in Ireland, not because of the Lady Freemason, but because of the history that it presents and the beauty that it presents to people.
Awesome. The
And
story is
with
called
that,
the book is called Doneraile Court: The Story of the Lady Freemason. If you're interested in getting a copy of it, we're going to make sure the links to get that through Amazon or through Kathleen's website are in the notes for this episode. The story revolves around a 17-year-old girl, as we talked about, eavesdropping, her family in the lodge, going through some degree, some ritual. What are we going to do with her? I've heard tale of things like this before. When you and I were talking about this before, and you shared all, you were kind enough to share an excerpt of your book and some of the other interviews that you've been on, and I'm reading about this just myself. I found it completely fascinating. I've heard a lot of the myths. What I'm also interested in is that you're sitting in the back seat and the cab driver's like, I know exactly what you're talking about. Like, how prevalent is this story and how relevant is it to the people in Ireland to today?
I would say widespread in Ireland, it's not. Locally in Doneraile, County Cork, Ireland, and in
Mm.
Cork City, Ireland, it is. But she is important enough that she's recognized as the only female member of regular Freemasonry in Ireland, to the extent that her portrait hangs in the Grand Lodge of Ireland.
Hmm. Okay.
Yes.
That's pretty
So
significant.
Yes, it certainly is. So when I first saw this story and saw the house, I have a great love of old houses, and I thought maybe if I wrote a book about this story, it could help raise money to help fix this house. Well, it took me 15 years to write this book, because anyone who studies Freemasonry knows that there is no end to it. You just keep going and going and going and going. So at one point, I I being a journalist, I'm not afraid to reach out to the people who I feel I need to talk to. So one of the people I reached out to is brother David Butler of Munster Freemasonry, and he is one of he's the archivist and the librarian in charge of some personal effects that Munster Freemasonry has that belong to her in her life, and they were uh, donated to the 2 months to the lodge, the provincial Grand Lodge, by family members later in life. So, of course, another strange synchronicity. When I reached out to him, he was here in New York City at the Waldorf Hotel. We met up, and I planned another trip to Ireland to do some research. And at that point is when I reached out to the OPW, and I asked them for permission to get inside the house. It hadn't been open to the public in years and years, and they allowed me to sit inside there, to sit inside the room where all of this happened, to imagine what was going on at the time, to imagine where her room was, to imagine um, where these men would have been, and the fear that she would have felt in order to write my book.
Mm.
They set with people to speak to. It was a really priceless experience.
And I'm imagining inside the house is kind of either set to the period piece of that time. And what I'm picturing when you say court and family estate is just this lavish property. What did you find when you walked inside?
Oh, it was falling apart. There was no furniture in there at all. Paint was peeling off the walls. And in the time that it took me to write this book, Ireland actually renovated the first floor. So
Mm.
just as I was about to release the book, they were getting ready to open the doors of Doneraile Court for the first time.
Wow.
Amazing, amazing time.
Now, I feel like I skipped over a very obvious question because as a Mason, I'm like, okay, I don't ever believe that men would say, oh my gosh, we heard this young woman overhearing our initiation. We must, put the sword to her. um,
Mhm.
when you heard that, like, how much did you know about Freemasonry? And what was like the first thought that went through your mind? And did it change as you started learning more about our ancient and gentle craft?
Well, yes, I didn't know much about Freemasonry. And my first thought was, what is so important that even her own father would even consider the possibility of killing his daughter to protect these secrets? Or was there something else going on? I think
Mm,
there might have been other things going on, maybe some rivalries in his town and his position. That's the thing. That's what made it so difficult. Is at that time, I am told, or it is out there, that what she saw that night would have been the first and 2 degrees combined. The third degree really didn't exist at that time.
yep.
1712 is what we're talking. So that's what makes this story so unique, is that it takes place prior to the creation of the Grand Lodge of England, prior to the creation of the Grand Lodge of Ireland, Scotland, all of them. So it's proof that Freemasonry was operative in private homes at
Hmm.
the time, and that her father was known as an ardent Freemason, and he held these meetings in his home.
Mm. And that's, we're always looking for those connections because people will point to, oh, 1717. That's when the United Grand Lodge of England, as we know it now, lodges came together. And Freemasonry always existed, but it was very hard to find documented proof, which is what, as a good journalist or just as person, you're looking for this so that there's not a mystery that's around this. And
I
you had,
spent way too much time looking at some old manuscripts that may have had absolutely no relevance to what I was doing.
oh,
So that was one of the hardest things I did.
I've sadly been down that rabbit hole myself. But then there's the rewarding stuff where you had mentioned that you had found a bridge that had a really cool Masonic limerick that points back to the origins of Freemasonry before we know 1717.
Well, this is actually something that you can buy a replica of online. It's called the Ball Bridge Square, and it's another piece of proof that Freemasonry was operating in Ireland for decades prior to the Grand Lodges. Which I mean, Freemasons know this, but there's not that much proof of it.
Mm.
This is a square that they found during the excavation of a bridge, Ball's Bridge, which is in County Limerick in the 1800s. And gosh, I had pulled up exactly what it says, and my screen went dark, but you can find it online. Do you want me to find it and just read it, and you can edit this?
Absolutely. She knows the
Oh,
magic
I forgot.
word.
Yeah. Okay, so here's what it says. Uh, I will strive to live with love and care upon the level by the square, and it's dated 1507.
Mm. Okay, so way before. Yeah. Yeah. 200 years
Yeah,
before.
way before.
Yeah. I love
Way
that.
before.
Here's the question that keeps going through my mind, and I'm going to say this with half a joke and half a smile on my face because there is some truth behind it. But a lot of women that I know have zero interest in Freemasonry, and the women that I know would be my wife, who's in the other room watching 90 Day Fiance or Kardashians or real Desperate Housewives of something right now. She has no interest in
Yeah.
anything that I do in this room, or lodge. Like the one question she asks when I tell her I'm going to lodge tonight is, "What time will you be home?" So I think for the brothers that were listening to this episode and are going, well, what would a 17-year-old girl find interesting about Freemasonry that she would want to sit there and continue listening to this, much less follow her dad or brother or other family members to this lodge to see what this was all about? I guess we'll never really know because no one was there to capture that part of the story. But I would ask you,
Right.
when you were going through your research on all of this, you had to have at least picked up a copy of Duncan's Ritual at the easiest
Oh
version
yeah,
of it and
that's
read through it.
yes.
Was
That's
there
what I
any?
ended up using.
I bet, yeah, it's widely. So, was there anything, Kathleen, that you found in your research where you're like, I could see how Elizabeth, a 17-year-old girl, would be interested in this, or you're just like, I actually kind of found this interesting, and I started having questions about what it all meant.
Well, I think this is a chicken and egg situation.
Mm.
Who knows that Freemasonry was her reason for spying? What if it was this guy she married 5 months later?
There's also that,
But
yeah.
what's right? I mean, she could have just been a hormonal 17-year-old girl who wanted to see what was going on and who the guys were behind there. But what's fascinating is that even when they agreed to put her through the paces, right, and make her the first ever female Freemason that night, do you think that they thought she was going to keep coming back? She did. And
Mm.
that is what really sets her apart from the rest. There are plenty of stories out there over the past couple of centuries about women who have hidden grandfather clocks or spied on tavern meetings, and they may have gone through the ritual up until the point that they saw, but she kept going, and she was an active Freemason throughout her entire life for the next 60 years. She died at age 80. She
Wow.
and her husband are the longest, because he was a Freemason too, are the longest serving married couple. Well, really, who can you name another married couple that's regular?
Right.
No. So, so that's really, I would say, the answer to that question is that she kept coming back. So, what was it about Freemasonry that fascinated her enough and intrigued her enough? And she was known in her lifetime for her philanthropy. So
Mm.
it meant a lot to her to take care of the people and the families around her throughout her life and into her old age. So that's where I am now, is I'm trying very hard to find out as much as I can about what happened with Elizabeth and her life and her life in Freemasonry post that night in
Mm.
November 1712.
Yeah, we ask that
And there
question a
are
lot here on the podcast. Like, what about these great men drew them to our fraternity? Did our fraternity make them great somehow, or were they already destined to be great and they picked up something from Freemasonry that they were ready to apply or carry forward in their life? I never really thought about that in the sense of like, what if somebody who quote unquote shouldn't have been there that night was able to get a slice of this and go, wow, this is the thing I've been looking for in my life, and I'm going to make this a part of me now.
That's how I described her in the book. That's how
Mm.
I imagined it happened for her. I've kind of figured she was probably a little bit like me. You know, maybe she would have been a journalist too today. Maybe she would have been a little bit nosy,
A truth
curious,
seeker.
gotten in trouble. Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a way better way of putting it. A truth seeker. But then, but the fact that she continued and had a full Masonic funeral when she died
Hmm.
is really about her life in Freemasonry.
Yeah, and I'd be interested to go through the documents to find out how she served the lodge, if she went through the officer chairs, if there were any committees or charitable work that she was a part of, and how it goes beyond being, hey, you were the first person that did this, and you shattered that ceiling and you broke through the door, so to speak, and you were accepted and you were taken by these brothers, and now you've become one of them. To then, what did you do after that? Like, what was your impact?
Well, you're going to love this because there's very little. There are some Doneraile papers that actually have handwritten at the top of it. If you're looking for information about the Lady Freemason, don't bother. It's not here.
Hmm.
The other thing, there is a letter from the female Grand Mistress, it is called, that was printed in a Dublin broadsheet in 1730s or 1740s, and it has been completely dismissed as a parody.
Hmm.
What that's pretty telling in itself. If it wasn't a parody and it really was from someone that could have possibly been her or someone else, another group of female Freemasons that had been operating at this time, that tells you but the men thought of them at that time, that they just dismissed it as a parody. Oh, don't worry about it. Jonathan Swift wrote that. It couldn't possibly be from a real female Freemason. There are none.
Mm.
So you also have to wonder about, if I can't imagine her going and knocking on a door in London and being accepted as she was, but in Dublin and in Cork, she was known to lead processions in full regalia and in her coat, going to a theater in Dublin, full regalia. She was as the Lady Freemason during her lifetime.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I wish, Doc Brown's time machine was around and relevant for us today. I've said this on other episodes, but this is one where I would just like to go back and get 30 minutes just talking to her and answering all of these questions. So I could be like, wow, this is a story that, yes, there's just that natural fascination of like, it's different. There's a little bit of myth, there's a little bit of intrigue, but then you kind of wonder, and we ask this question all the time to the men who come on the podcast as brothers and say, how did Freemasonry make you a better man? Well, in this case, how did Freemasonry make you a better person? And how did you make better people because of your connection to this craft? So I want to get back to that initial question, though. You're going through Duncan's ritual, and I'm imagining you're like, what is this all about? Were there any parts of our Masonic lessons or anything that you had read in that? Because we can openly talk about it. It's out in publication. I'm not going to be violating any secrets, but was there anything as an outsider that interests you? Because I never really get the chance to talk to people, men or women, about this, because I find that today the allure or the excitement of discovering the Freemasons, it's like, I can just do a Google search, watch a couple YouTube videos. I'm good.
Right. You can watch a few documentaries. Well, I was more familiar with the way American Freemasons operated just from watching things on TV. So the biggest eye-opening thing was the way the Irish operate is very different. For example, they don't wear their aprons over their blazers. They wear them under. So one of my first drafts of my book before David Butler from Cork started a copy editing, he had to change that for me. Oh no, it's this way here. And I thought, well, that sounds a lot more comfortable than wearing it on top of the
You don't have the loose button problem as much. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Right. So there's that, and then I'd say the other big eye opener for me was the point of the compass, and it's the point of a dagger in Ireland.
Okay.
So being that I was writing about a woman, and I actually address this in the book. How do you handle exposing the left breast for this ritual?
Yeah.
And really, in 1712, did this part of the ritual, did it look like this? I don't know. That was I would say, the single most difficult decision in writing the book, was when I said, stop and just go with this. You're writing fiction, and it is okay to give the people who are going to be reading this a glimpse of what it looks like today. Give the people who are reading this something to identify with, right? And stop worrying so much.
I wish I could just get that on repeat on like a loop, because it's funny, Kathleen, in 2025, that is when we talk about the idea of women in Freemasonry. What you just talked about with the point on which you're received coming into a lodge, that is one of the number one things that some men have a problem with, having women in the fraternity. They don't think about the mind, the intellect, the value of what this person can bring as far as insight and experiences. They just think about the physical difference. And I thought we were way past that,
No, it'll still be an issue. But you can get around it.
Well, one young lady was able to work her way through this. Her name is Elizabeth St. Ledger. The book is called Doneraile Court, The Story of the Lady Freemason. We're talking with Katheleen Foster Aldworth. So many names. Katheleen Aldworth Foster, the author of Doneraile Court. You've kind of outlined some of the issues we have as the facts of the case, as a lawyer would say. Like, we know these bullet points, but because of the time that we're going into, there was journals or letters or documents for you to kind of really get into the grist of her story. So at one point, you're writing this as you want this to be a nonfiction. As you mentioned, it becomes a fiction book. I'm interested, without giving away the story so that our listener has the opportunity to enjoy this in the book, when did we start to get you and your ideas into the story of
Mm.
young Elizabeth?
Well, I had to create characters. I had to create a whole secondary storyline that I based on real history in the area, but had to create the butler, for example. I couldn't find his name in anything really,
Mm,
so I used him as an opportunity to create another little piece of drama. And the things that happened to him absolutely did not happen in real life. That's 100% made up. And I had a
gotcha.
really hard time with that. I knew that I had to do this, but if you get my book, I included a quote from one of the best historical fiction authors, and that is that historical fiction, you have a story that provides the scaffold to what you're writing, and then you are the as the author have to fill in the rest.
Hmm. Yeah, I
That
immediately
is,
started thinking of other historical miniseries that are super popular or streaming series like Peaky Blinders comes to mind. Um, a lot of that is based loosely, as you had said, little historical accuracy, some narrative storytelling that's involved there. I think Highlander would be another series of folks who are familiar with that. That would be at least the timeline would kind of overlap with the story and where Elizabeth was at that point in time. um 18th century, though, that must have been a really interesting one because life was a lot different back then when it came to classes and society and what they looked at as, well, we would call them traditional roles, but what a woman's role is. How did you embrace that, or how did you write about that? How does it become part of the narrative in your story?
Um, well, I mean, I think I addressed it. I think that she was a little bit more lucky than any other woman because she was in such close proximity to a situation like this.
Mm,
That she was the daughter of a viscount. She wasn't a peasant woman or even an Irish woman living there. So she was exposed to things that she might not have been exposed to otherwise. But I think that what we discussed before is the biggest difference is that she kept going. She was a trailblazer in 1712 in a way that women are still today struggling to fight their way through to the things that they want to do. I mean, female Freemasonry is accepted in some places, but there are no regular lodges,
mm,
and there are a few that are named after her. So her legacy continues. The first ever co-masonry under Le Droit Humain in France was named after her. And there's a very, very active group of female Freemasons in Brazil, and their lodge is also named after her.
oh,
So
that's cool.
even years later, her legacy as a trailblazing Freemason lives on.
Hmm. We've talked about some of the significant history that Doneraile Court is able to kind of tie into and proving the existence of Freemasonry before it was officially opened and kind of revealed, as most Masonic scholars and brothers would say, 1717 with the formation of the Grand Lodge of England. Um, I know that there is a big movement that's happening now to preserve the history of Doneraile Court and the story of the Lady Freemason. Can you tell us what our brothers in Cork County are doing to do this in Ireland?
Oh, yes, sure. So there is a fundraising push right now. They're calling it the Lady Freemason Appeal. There is a collection of her personal artifacts that are in the hands of uh, the Provincial Grand Lodge of Munster. So this is the County Cork area, and they are raising money to create a permanent exhibit space for her. Prior to this, her things have just been in behind glass frames in their dining room. So in addition to this, they're also trying to put in an elevator. So she's actually buried not far from Freemasons Hall in Cork. So you can also go to uh, Cork Cathedral where she's buried, and there's a plaque there commemorating her. And then there's also the house, Doneraile Court, which is, as I mentioned, owned by the state of Ireland. And they have now since completed the first and second floors. They would call it the ground and the first floors. And they have just gotten the money to put on an orangery that used to be there adjoining the house. They're going to recreate that. So together, the state of Ireland, the OPW, and the Freemasons in Cork are working together to keep her story alive and to use it to raise money for both accounts to keep this um, to keep her artifacts in good shape and the story around for generations to come.
Yeah, I can see this being not only just a community or a local piece of history with the landmark, but also the tie to our fraternity. So we'll make sure that brothers listening, if you're like, hey, I want to give generously, I want to learn more about this, the link to be a part of it will be in the notes for this episode. Before we get you out of here, we teased this at the very beginning, and I know that there's something special that's in the works here, but I love when a great story like this becomes a book and it becomes highly successful. And then it's like, okay, this would be perfect if I could watch it as a movie or a short limited series on it. What do you have plans for next to share this story?
Well, so it does have an option agreement for a television series that's right now in the process of morphing into a film. So what we're thinking is a film that's more true to the book. And I have plans to write 2 more books that are more about Elizabeth peeling away the onion,
Mm.
finding out what's behind Freemasonry, what are the connections to the Knights Templar, what would she want to find out. I, as a journalist, plan to act as her. Really, I am in a point where I'm not a Freemason. I don't feel like I could become a Freemason at this time. I hope to later, but not until I'm done peeling away that onion with Elizabeth. So
Mm.
people can tune in to a TV series or a film, whichever comes of it. But you know what the nicest part about this is? I donated a bunch of books to the Lady Freemason Appeal for them to sell as part of this fundraiser. And a local actor in Ireland who's also a Freemason bought one. And he's the one who gave it to the producers initially. So it all ties back to the Lady Freemason and her acts of goodwill and her acts of philanthropy. And that's the reason why I got an option agreement in the first place. It's because I donated books to be sold and all the profits to go back to Munster Freemasonry.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I hope the light that Elizabeth finds leads you, Kathleen, to seeking your own, Masonically speaking, of course. The website is DonerailCourt.com. That's also the name of the book, Doneraile Court, the story of the Lady Freemason. Katheleen Aldworth Foster has been our guest on this episode of the Craftsmen Online podcast. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your interest.